All right. So here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am super excited to have as my guest today, Shari Botwin. Shari, welcome.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, Shari. So Shari is a licensed clinical social worker. She's been counseling survivors of all types of trauma in her Cherry Hill, New Jersey private practice for over 22 years. Her second book, Thriving After Trauma, Stories of Living and Healing, addresses readers who've experienced trauma or loss due to a variety of experiences, whether abuse, accident, or injury. Shari shows through personal stories how many have experienced the worst kinds of trauma have managed to move on and thrive beyond their experiences. She's given keynote presentations at a variety of universities and professional conferences, and has also provided commentary on a variety of international media platforms. All right, Shari, welcome to the podcast. Great to have an East Coaster on.
Oh yeah, this is great. And thanks again for having me.
You're welcome. So are you originally from the East Coast?
I am. I'm from New Jersey.
Okay. And you're there currently?
That's where I work. I actually live in Pennsylvania, but I work in Cherry Hill, which is where I grew up.
Okay, cool. I'm from the East Coast. I lived in Jersey. I lived in
Ah,
Pennsylvania also. So
okay.
nice. All right, so let's start. So how the heck did you get into this field? I mean, it's so crazy.
Yeah.
You know, I was talking with someone and they're like, "God, you have so much passion for this topic." And I'm like, man, I guess I know it kind of feels a little, I said, it feels weird. She said, no, it's not. But anyway, I'm drawn to people like yourself who've been doing this. How did you get into this?
I love it too, I have to say. You know what? I always knew I was going to be some type of a therapist. I had no idea I would end up being a trauma specialist. That word trauma, I never even heard of it. I think what happened was as soon as I graduated with my master's degree and I started working at an inpatient facility that specialized in eating disorders, I was noticing that most of the people coming into the treatment center had eating disorders because of things that they had gone through, all different types of trauma, things that they had never dealt with. And I also noticed that many of the people that were checking into the rehab got as sick as they got because they never really addressed what happened to them, whether it was losing a parent suddenly, having a history of abuse, being injured in a sport. And what happened was I left the eating disorder rehab within a couple of years of working there. I recognized I had a whole bunch of my own trauma that I had buried. So I got myself into recovery from trauma. And then within a few years after being in intensive therapy for myself, more and more people were coming to my practice wanting to work through different types of trauma. And most of them had eating disorders, but some of them were coming to me because they also had developed all different types of addiction, self-destructive coping strategies, all kinds of stuff. So it sort of just happened. I would have never known in my 20s that as I approached 50, this would be the work that I would be doing.
When you were in that setting and you started to see this, what was it like for you to realize and to feel in a sense that, you know, yes, these people had addictions and they were having these symptoms in a sense, but there was other stuff going on. And when you realized it was trauma, we're talking about abuse of varying kinds and on and on and on. How did you personally handle that? How did that land for you?
So I think what happened was within weeks of starting there were a lot of young women talking about that they were getting ready to discharge and that now that their eating disorder was manageable, they weren't as sick in it, they felt more stabilized. They knew they needed to go out and start dealing with what happened to them. So when I would sit in the groups with them, and this was before I even ran the groups, I so related to their stories. I would drive home from work every day and think, I really need to do something. I need to get help because the things that these women are saying are so much what I experience, so much what I feel. I started asking a lot of questions to supervisors I was working with. I started asking myself a lot of questions. And I also noticed I would get home from work and then I would sit in a chair. I'll never forget this chair and just sort of stare off into space. And I knew I wasn't okay. I knew things were going on in my heart. I knew things were going on in my body. And I just sort of over and over kept thinking to myself, go do something, go get help for this. And I think in some ways, that's why I'm able to do the work that I'm doing. If I hadn't have gone and gotten the help that I got and continue to get for decades,
Mm-hmm.
I would never be able to do this. And I think 22 years ago, there wasn't really a lot of talk about trauma.
Right.
Again, I don't think people even understood the word post traumatic stress disorder. These are words that we really just started talking about 5, 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you felt that something wasn't wrong, was it a vague kind of amorphous feeling, or was it like you knew what was wrong and you could feel it?
I knew sort of what was wrong. I knew it wasn't about my life in the moment. It wasn't about my life in the present, but I knew that it was about many years that had followed me. So at the time that I was working there, I was 26, 27, and I had just moved out of my home, my childhood home, when I was 23. So I knew this wasn't something that just happened one day. I could kind of see myself at different ages. I saw the beginnings of my eating disorder and when it developed, and that was really around the age of 12. And I would reflect on all the years when I was in college and even in high school where my eating disorder really turned into something very severe and misunderstood and something that I didn't really talk about. Yes, I was losing a lot of weight and people were saying, "Oh, you look so great. What are you doing? How are you doing that?" So for me, it gave me a sense of purpose and drive. And I finally felt like, well, people are accepting me, but I never felt like I fit in. I just
Mm.
felt like I just don't belong here. And a lot of times I would want to disappear. A lot of times I would think about maybe the world would be better off without me. I could feel the pain in my body. And when people would talk at the Renfrew Center, which is where I worked, and they would talk about the despair and the shame and the rage, I didn't know those words, but I knew the feelings that they were describing.
So you go through this training, you start to seek out your own therapy. How do things evolve such that you're working as a therapist and you're writing these books? Take us through that journey in a sense.
So I spent many years just working. When I got into my recovery, once I broke my silence, which is actually March 7th, it will be 20 years that I told my therapist. I celebrate my anniversaries, even the ones that are sad.
You sell what silence did you break?
That was the day that I told my therapist that I had been raped by
Okay.
a family member. I spent months sort of telling her, having all these body memories, having flashbacks, nightmares, depressive episodes. But it was on March 7th, and I'll never forget the day. I
Mm.
was sitting in my bedroom and I just picked up the phone and I called her and I said, somebody went inside of me. Somebody did something to me that they should not have done. Once I spoke that, it felt like almost like Pandora's box opened. I'm not going to lie and say it was pretty. It was very difficult. It was very painful. I spent a good 3 to 5 years just going to therapy and working more with people who were wanting to manage their symptoms, not so much trauma work. I wasn't in a place where I was equipped. And I think, again, 20 years ago, a lot of people weren't talking about abuse
Right.
or PTSD. So it was a period of time that I went to therapy. I would go home, regroup, reset, and then I went to my office and I worked. And if it weren't for my office, I don't know if I would have made it. There were so many times when I thought, I can't do this. It's painful to talk about even now because I remember what it was like. But I had so much drive and determination, and I knew, Shari, when you're in a place where you're okay, you will write about this, you will speak about this, you will use this to help other people. And that kept me going. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Hang on one second here. All right, that's okay. We can just fix that at.
I'm sorry about that. If
No,
that
it's no,
happens
no.
again, do you want me to just keep talking?
Yeah,
I'll
no, it's no
just talk
problem at
through it.
all. It's
Okay.
really no problem at all.
Yeah,
It's just.
I thought I turned off all the notifications, but the calls come through still.
So, okay, so let's continue here. So,
Okay.
first of all, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's obviously intense. So, you're talking about getting to a point where, you're not ready to work with individuals who had experienced trauma or even talk about that. How do things evolve for you?
I think what happens was I gave myself a lot of time to just work through all of the memories, all of the feelings. I reached out to all different kinds of therapists who were in the field a lot longer than I was. I had a wonderful supervisor. I had an amazing therapist. And what happened was maybe 10 years after I broke my silence, then I started feeling like I don't want to just go to work anymore. I don't want to just sit with people and talk about what happened to them. I want to start speaking. I want to start writing. And I would think about it. I didn't necessarily act on it because I also 10 years ago started to work on having a family. So that became my focus. It took me almost a year to get pregnant. And then I was pregnant, and then I had Andrew. And I think at that point, my focus was continuing to recover and deal with whatever feelings I had about being a parent, go to work and come home and continue to work on feelings I had about being a parent. And I knew, again, I knew I was going to write about it. And I never sat down and wrote. I just
Hmm.
have all these different memories of, it's almost like I would mark different experiences I had as a parent. And I thought, I need to get out there and talk about this because I'm working with patients who are afraid to become a parent because of things that happen to them, or who are afraid of intimacy because they're so afraid of loss. And I just would sit with it. I would say to myself, when the time is right, it will happen. It was about maybe it's 5 years now, when the Cosby story broke in 2015, end of 2015. I was sitting on my sofa one day and I was watching a couple of different specials with, there were about 15 or 20 of the accusers, and they're telling their stories. And as I'm sitting there, I'm so focused on them and I'm thinking, I admire them, and this is an amazing thing that they're doing, and I can't believe that they're doing this. And I literally
Hmm.
turned the television off. My little guy was sleeping. I think he was like 4 and a half. I sat down on my computer and I just started writing. I started writing op-eds. I started writing articles. I attended the Cosby trial, the first one,
Wow.
continued to speak more. And then what I did was I started practicing. I thought, well, I'm not going to go and write a book. I need to see how I feel about outing myself. So on the second year anniversary of hashtag Me Too, I published something in Thrive Global, and I decided I was going to write what happened to me. And I don't write specifics, I don't go into detail, but I actually claimed or owned, yes, I am an incest survivor. And from there, things just sort of unfolded. I hired an editor. I sat here in my bedroom where I am now talking with you, and I spent a year just working on a proposal. I thought about what will it be like, not only to write this book, but to actually speak about my experiences, and what will it be like for my patients, and how can I share their stories and protect their confidentiality. So a lot of different conversations I was having with colleagues, my editor, my agent who I signed with 3 years ago, and from there things just happened. Very freeing. Like right now, I'm like feeling a combination of it's sad and it's painful. And I also have these images of dancing around my house, sort of celebrating the ability to not just have the words and understand my experiences, but to be able to talk with other people day in and day out who are liberating themselves with their own stories. I feel like the work that we do, yes, it's difficult, yes, it's painful, but it's so, and like you're saying, people don't understand your passion. The passion comes from the joy of overcoming, the freedom that comes from speaking, the ability to say on air, yes, I am an incest survivor, and not feel like I have to hide under the covers.
Hmm. So in the bio that I shared, we talk about your second book, Thriving After Trauma: Stories of Living and Healing. Um, that's your second book. Your first book was more of about what happened and how you managed, or what?
So when you ask questions, I read the questions you were going to ask today. One of the questions you asked was, what was one of the biggest mistakes you made earlier in your
Yeah.
career? I think one of my biggest mistakes was writing that book. At that time, I was not ready to speak or say who I was. So the book it was similar to this book in that I did share patient stories, but I also shared my story under a pseudonym. I wasn't ready to
Mm-hmm.
say what happened to me. And as I was writing that book, my abuser was dying from cancer. So the writing itself was very therapeutic, but the publication of the book, it just really didn't go very well. And what ended up happening was the publisher didn't stay open. They were maybe open for 6 months. So once they closed, the book started reproduce or stopped reproducing. And I think in some ways it was a blessing for me. I think that was sort of the dress rehearsal. And I wasn't really that upset about it because I knew I'm not really ready for this and I don't want to do it like this. I don't want to make up names and talk about some patient. I want to talk about myself. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
talk in the third person. So it really ended up working out at the way it was supposed to.
So the book, Thriving After Trauma: Stories of Living and Healing, is a collection of stories about how people, um, excuse me, move through their trauma, in a sense, and thrive. What is it that, when you sit down with someone and you're working with someone, how do you, and granted this is different for each person in a sense,
Yeah.
but what, from your perspective,
Mhm.
what is it that allows people to get to a point? You talked about, I want to get to that point where I could talk about my own experience. What is it that allows people to get to that point?
I mean, I think the first thing is walking in the therapist's door and developing a connection and feeling a sense of safety. And I think then giving themselves a chance to just be in therapy and see what it's like to work on understanding the role of things like their eating disorder or their destructive coping strategies that they've utilized for sometimes 10, 20, 30 years. And I think people get to a point where they want more. Usually, when someone walks in my office, I mean, I don't really know much about what happened to them, and I don't ask direct questions when I first sit down with somebody. I join them where they are. But oftentimes, within a year or two of being in therapy, that's when people start really shedding the layers of the
Mm.
onion. That's when they really start speaking. And it's different for everybody. But I think what happens is they're sitting in therapy thinking, I don't want to just talk about my eating disorder. I had one person, she was in so much pain and she said, "Shari, I am so sick of this eating disorder. I don't want it anymore." And I knew, I mean, a part of me knows in order for her to let go of that eating disorder, she's going to need to speak more about the body hatred, the shame. And while I didn't know that she was repressing trauma, I knew she was burying so much pain. And I
Mhm.
think what I love about the work is that once you walk into a therapist's office and you feel the safety and you feel the connection, what I bring in there is I bring a sense of hope into the room. And I don't say these words. I don't get up and start dancing and doing all kinds of things that people end up seeing me do, but I sit with them and I hold whatever it is that they need until they're ready. I'm a very, while I'm determined and persistent, I'm also very patient. I don't feel it's my right to rush somebody along or say, "Can't you just say what's wrong?" That's not
Right.
that. While sometimes I'll think that, I don't do that because they need me to wait until they're ready. And I think from there things just happen.
People who are listening to this are, students, therapists with a variety of experiences, and many of whom probably have experienced their own traumas of varying degrees and so forth. what is it? I mean, you've been doing this for obviously a long time. You have experience. What do you see kind of early clinicians, the kind of maybe mistakes that they make, or, you know, errors they make?
I think the biggest error that many early clinicians make, including myself, was that feeling of wanting to fix it. I think when you start working in the field and you see someone in so much pain, and again, we're human beings, so we
Right.
don't want to see people in pain, but I think the idea that we want to say, well, maybe you should try this, or did you do that, or maybe you could have done that. And I think our level of patience and being able to just sit and be, that's something I think that we learn the more and more experience we have. So that's the one error. The other error, I think, or the other mistake or mishap, is sometimes our boundaries in the work early on, they're not as tight or they're not as clear because we have all that countertransference with patients. And when you're earlier in the work and you're younger, you may not understand as much about yourself. So I remember when I first started working in the field, I took things personally. If somebody was mad or they said they didn't want to work with me anymore, it would like hurt my feelings. And I knew where that was coming from. So I learned how to manage that feeling and talk with people about it. My colleagues were normalizing and saying to me, Shari, you're not going to be able to help every single person. And if somebody decides they don't want to work with you, it's okay. It's not
Right.
something you should feel at fault for. So I think to be able to just talk with mentors and colleagues and supervisors about whatever feelings get stirred up for you, that's something I think as we go through time, we learn how to better manage.
So who's the book for? Thriving After Trauma: Stories of Living and Healing. Who's your target audience in a sense?
Really the public. I didn't write this book for clinicians. I wrote this book for survivors. I wrote this book for family members. I wrote this book for people who want to understand and know more about trauma. I feel like a lot of what's happening is I'm getting messages every day from people who know that they survived trauma, but they don't know what to do now. So, in some
Mhm.
ways, this book is for maybe people who recognize that they need help, but they have no idea where to go. And I also wrote this book for people who are going through the hardest parts of their recovery because I don't want them to feel like this is going to be the rest of their life. That's why I felt like it was important to tell stories so that they could kind of see the process unfolding. And ultimately, in most of the stories, it's not happy ever after. But what is wonderful that we get to see in these stories that they are getting married, they are becoming parents, they are sticking up for themselves, they are reporting their abusers. So they're seeing the transformation of when they're not speaking to when they're first getting help to what happens after you accept and understand your experience.
Just as a reminder, I'm speaking with Shari Botwin. Her book is Thriving After Trauma: Stories of Living and Healing. You know, you talked about some of your early clinical errors, and I'm wondering if you feel that you know, newer clinicians, or maybe even not just newer clinicians, but there's a tendency to want to get to the underlying truth in a sense, because oftentimes, you know, we hear about people who um, have addictions or eating disorders, etc., and there's probably pain of some kind going on there. And I'm wondering if you feel, or you've seen, there's a tendency to just want to really go for that, because that's where the gold is, in a sense. That's where, you know, we're going to be able to help. What are your thoughts on that?
So I do struggle with that. And I'm thinking about a person right now, as you're asking me this, that I've been working with for a long time who struggles with eating disorders and severe bouts of depression. And we both know that she's burying and that she's repressing. We've sort of started to explore and then she'll retreat and then we'll push a little bit more and then she'll pull back and life happens. She's been through multiple losses over the last several years. She was diagnosed with a severe form of cancer. All these things happen and what I say to myself is She may not be able to speak. This might be as far as we can go.
Mm,
And that's okay. It's not, you know, as therapists, we want everybody to have the best lives possible, but maybe that is the best life that she can live, especially with the illnesses that she's dealt with and the losses. So I think sometimes we just have to remember it's not it's not so black and white. If somebody can come into my office and acknowledge that they've experienced trauma, maybe for them that is freeing, and maybe that's what they needed to do. For somebody else who's repressing and uncovering years of trauma, they need to come in and tell me what happened to them, and they tell me all of the things that they're feeling in their bodies and what they're remembering, and that for that person might be what she needs to do. So I think it's very individual. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to approach the work. And I think if we are open and accepting and we can tolerate and be with whatever feelings they bring and whatever they're ready to work on, then we're doing them a great service.
in terms of people who are interested in pursuing more education in trauma and how to do this work, in terms of modalities or education, how do you advise people? Should they, well, do MDR? Should they study somatic experiencing? Where do people? What do you say to that?
I say definitely look into all these different forms of treatment, because clearly EMDR has done wonders for some people and all these other different strategies. What I think is, if you really want to be able to do the work and do it well, go to therapy for yourself. Even if you haven't lived through trauma, go to therapy and explore your earlier experiences and learn how to identify where your insecurities come from or where your self-doubt comes from. That's, for me, I think that's been the most education, is just being able to learn about who I am
Mm,
and understand it. And again, for some people, they don't really feel the need to do that. So they may find themselves ferociously reading books or listening to your show or going online and reading about different stories. So I think, again, it's different for everybody. But if you're curious and you want to know more and you want to be better in the work, don't stop looking at yourself. Don't stop asking for help. You know, there's no such thing as, well, you know, I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't really need supervision anymore. I don't agree with that. I think we always need people to talk
mm,
to. We always need people to ask questions. And I think for as long as I'm doing this work, I will continue to reach out to people who've been doing the work longer and can give me advice and help me to kind of take a step back, especially when I feel like I don't really fully understand what I'm reacting to, or I need help
awesome.
with self-care, because that's
Right.
another huge thing in the work.
Awesome. In terms of go-to book recommendation, whether trauma related or not, what would you share?
There are so many books out there. The one that keeps coming up over and over is The Body Keeps Score. I keep hearing that title, Bessel van der Kolk.
Yep.
Um, there's another book that I would highly recommend. It's called The Girls, and it was written by Abigail Pesta. She was involved in the Larry Nassar trial. She's a journalist, and she wrote a book about some of the gymnasts that we don't necessarily hear as much about. And from the second I opened that book, I felt affirmed. I felt
Oh,
understood. It's a wonderful book, and there's so many other books out there. I feel like any stories that are about therapists who are also survivors, memoirs. The Sidron organization, which specializes in PTSD. They have a whole list of books. People can also go to RAINN, RAINN. They actually have a bookstore. So Abigail's book is on that bookstore list. And for people who are recovering from abuse, there's about 30 books on there
mm,
that people can go to. So it's really about what kind of trauma, what kind of PTSD issues are you wanting to know more about. Veterans associations, if you're working with a lot of soldiers who've served. So all different types
all
of
right.
resources out there, and there's no such thing as too many things to read.
Awesome. All right, Shari. Your website is sharibotwin.com. That's SHARIBOTWIN.com. We'll have the show notes and her book as well as her suggestions, linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you, Shari?
So the best way they can reach me is they can go on my website, and there they'll find my email address, and I'll spell it out. It's sharilcsw@comcast.net.
Awesome. All right, Shari, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom, man. It's been a pleasure having you on here.
It's been awesome. Thanks for having me.